That joke isn't funny anymore. Available on Amazon and everywhere. Hey guys, welcome back to the Lou Perez podcast. I'm your host, Lou Perez, and today I am so fortunate to be joined by my next guest. His name is Peter Moskos, and he's an author. He has a number of books out, Greek Americans, Cop in the Hood, and his latest is Back from the Brink, Inside the NYPD in New York City's extraordinary 1990s crime drop. Peter, thanks, man, for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for reaching out to me.
Yeah, I mean, I've been following you for, a number of years. And you've been I think just such a great source of information when it comes to crime and policing, because I feel like my introduction to crime and policing kind of always came from more, I would say, kind of like activist people. It was like, people with a real like anti-policing abolitionist bent to them, or, back the blue no matter what. Like those are kind of the places where I was getting my info, where over the years, I feel like you've been a very fair, even keel interpreter of what's going on. And I really appreciate that. So I want to just lead with just thanking you for that.
Thanks. It's I would say it's somewhat unfortunate or ironic. I don't know that to get credit for that, because man, it's a vast middle ground. It's not really a tough needle to thread, but I know what you're saying. You do just tend to hear from people on sort of the 100% pro or con side of policing. And it's, policing is necessary and it could be better. Like that's it's not that complicated in that sense. The details get more complicated, but yeah, I've sort of lost patience with both of those extremes.
Yeah, and before we get into discussions of crime and policing, one of the things I just wanted to talk to you about, because I don't think a lot of people know about it, is the history of Greek Americans. And we were just talking a little bit earlier, where we're from. I'm from Queens originally, Woodside. So I spent a lot of time as a kid in Astoria, on Steinway Street. When I moved to Little Neck, one of my best friends is Mike Manakakis, or Manakakis, I think might be the better pronunciation of it. So I've grown up among New York Greeks, in particular. But it seems like kind of as an ethnic group, it's kind of almost kind of forgotten, or you guys are kind of, not saying you're in the shadows or anything, like that, but not a lot of people know about, Greek Americans, and you wrote a book about it. So.
Yeah, it's, I live in Astoria, Queens, which is really the largest Greek neighborhood outside of Greece. And I've been here 22 or 3 years now, and it has become less Greek. And I think you can move to Astoria now and not even know it's, the Greek town of America. But it's still a big presence. Greeks I've never been large in numbers, but but we do punch above our weight in terms of politics and wealth. And I actually think the defining moment was it's years ago, but my Big Fat Greek Wedding kind of put Greeks on the map. And that movie was such a big hit because it turns out that it appealed to all immigrant groups, and not just Greeks, but so many other people could relate to it. A fun fact about that movie, and this is not inflation adjusted, but it made more money than Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Like, that's how big it was.
Wow.
And people, still make references to that movie, but kind of normalize that. Mike Dukakis running for president, though he lost, and who knows if his last name helped or hurt him or didn't matter. But it's, the book actually started as my father's book. And once he passed away, I kind of just wanted to have a Moskos and Moskos book. And so it's the third edition I wrote. And it's the one no one ever talks about. So thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah. So Charles, is that your dad?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Because when I first saw it, I thought like maybe it was a collaboration with a brother or something like that. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Were you with your dad writing that like from the beginning? Was he sharing stuff with you, or is it kind of something he was doing by himself and then you came onto it?
Well, as I say, we were sort of not writing it together for a long time. It was kind of in the cards. And once he died in 2008, I thought the book would die with him. But the publisher reached out to me and said they wanted the third edition. And that's when I realized it's actually really hard to update a book that was written in the 1970s because we didn't even have a digital copy of it. First you had to scan it, and then it's extremely heavily revised because it was 40 years later or whatever, and simply new research methods. The computer exists now, so I could access census data and things like that. And one of the things I found was, compared to other ethnicities, if there's a lot of outmarriage for Greek Americans, and usually that's considered the death of a group through assimilation. But I looked at, because the census allows you to put two ethnicities down for your background, and when people put down two ethnicities, I simply looked at which was first, ethnicity A or ethnicity B. And it turns out that Greeks, along with Italians, which is interesting, are most likely to be listed first. It sort of it dominates the other identity. And I'm an example that my mother is German-born, so I'm half German, but I don't really, relate to that half or feel particularly German. So the Greek part tends to dominate, and partly it might be. I mean, Greeks again are, as a group, successful in America, but there's really no downside to being Greek. There's not a bad history like there is with Germany. People tend to look favorably to the culture. The food is good. Traveling there is always fun. So
going to antiquity. I mean, really. I mean, it's Greek.
Yeah.
Well,
so that's the. I doubt there will be a fourth edition, though. I do have a close family friend who's urging me to continue it, but I doubt I will. I think that was a one-off.
Was your dad born in Greece? Was he an
No,
immigrant?
he was born in Chicago, as was I. His parents were, born subjects of the Ottoman Empire, which sounds very exotic. But they come from northern Epirus or southern Albania today. And so it's interesting that none of them actually lived in what is Greece proper or had a Greek passport, but they were ethnically Greek when they came to America, and always identified as that. But my grandfather also spoke Albanian, though I think he lost that. But he lived with us too till he passed away when I was a kid.
Yeah, my dad is a immigrant from Argentina, and he came here in I think 76 or 77, and he's not a writer; he's a butcher by trade, and just the fact that he is from Argentina and he's a man of that time, he's almost alien, to like our sensibilities, like the stories that he has back from his homeland in Argentina are insane. I mean, the stuff that happens. So one of my goals, and it's something that I'm sort of been kicking myself probably for the last 10 years, is that I haven't like sat him down and just put like a recorder in his face and just said, "Hey Dad, tell me that story again about the time that guy was shooting at you for any number of reasons, and and just kind of go from there."
You should do that. I've done that with my mother, who is still alive, because she grew up in bombed out Germany. So she has stories, most of which I've heard, but some of which I hadn't. And I tried to do that with my father before he died, partly because he would, tell the same stories over and over again. And I was like, I'm going to miss those when he's gone.
Yeah.
But it's funny. I couldn't get he slipped into being interviewed mode, and it wasn't his natural voice. And I was like, that's too bad. I really just wanted to have the recorder running, in the background for a day in the life. But yeah, those stories, once they go, they go. So it is important to document them, which, yeah. I mean, it's as a segue, that my book that's about to come out, Back from the Brink, is interviewing, primarily old cops about their background and their experience from the 70s to the 90s. And man, do they have stories. And I would always start with asking what their parents did, because I found that interesting, which sort of threw them for a loop a little bit, because that's not what the focus was, but to show sort of the extremely humble backgrounds from which they come, and to highlight sort of the working class aspect, because and though you don't hear it in the book, though you might a little bit, but man, the death of the New York accent is greatly exaggerated, because these guys still have it, most of them, and man, I love that.
Yeah, I so I'm from Queens. I went to high school in Long Island, and then I went to NYU for college. And I had my thick Queens accent all the way, into college, and I didn't actively try to get rid of it at all. I guess I started doing sketch comedy, so I was doing more acting, and I guess, and probably other things where I had to enunciate. So maybe over the years it kind of went away. But I went to school with girls from Oklahoma, from Georgia, who actively tried to get rid of their accents. And you look back now, and it's like, man, it's like you talk about what makes language, so I don't know, so beautiful and fun are the way that words are pronounced. And yeah, that the old New York accent. My mom still has it. My brothers still have it. And yeah, it's almost like protecting like an old tribal language.
Well, I wish. I mean, I never had that much of a Chicago accent because of my bougie, upper middle class Evanston upbringing. But it is funny because when I hear now family and friends talk, I'm like, oh, when did they develop the Chicago accent? And I'm like, oh no, they've always had it. I just never heard it until now I've been gone for decades. But I love those. I mean, also, man, Baltimore's got a great one, and that's I when I hear that, it just warms my heart. But yeah, I've lived in places with good accents, Boston and Baltimore and New York, and they're precious, man.
Yeah, yeah. And with the cops that you interviewed, it's interesting, sort of the people who go into police work, because kind of like I said at the beginning, where a lot of the messaging that I hear often comes from like activists who are very, anti-cop. And for a lot of people, I know for a lot of like, immigrants who came here, depending on where they're from, like being a cop was like a terrible thing. Like, oh my God, it was a curse if my son became a police officer. What did you find, talking with the police as far as, them going into that line of work? Was it something that was accepted, something that was like, oh, praised?
The typical cop would say, I just took all the city service tests, civil service tests, took all the city exams because I needed, it's my father or uncle said, it's a stable job, work for the city. So it could have been sanitation or DOC or anything. And the police called first. Then there were a few who came from police backgrounds who were more drawn to that. The only time that it received a not positive response, and it wasn't even that negative, I found was from Jewish cops. And, New York is unusual in that it has a lot of Jewish cops. But that was sometimes like, well, you could have been a lawyer.
Right. Your brother's a doctor, and yeah, now my son's the police officer. Well, when you joined the force, you were a police officer in Baltimore, right?
Yeah, in Baltimore City, but an unusual one because I was a Harvard grad student in sociology at the time. And when I went to Baltimore, I was not planning on becoming a cop, but it was just research for my dissertation. And through a lot of twists of fate, but I mean, not pleasant at the time, those twists, but I banked my career on that. So I became a cop until I got civil service protection. So I worked for a grand total of 20 months, which, is not a lot. I joke it's 20. I did 20 and out, but they're months and not years. But, if you're it's where The Wire was filmed, where I policed in the Eastern District of Baltimore. If you're going to be a cop for a short time, you learn pretty quickly there. But it was, I appreciate it. I mean, it is a tough job, but it also, it's work, whatever. I did the best I could for 20 months and then realized, I could have stayed, but I don't think I wanted to live in Baltimore for the rest of my life. And the cops I was working with were like, you'd be a fool. Like, I had an opportunity to get a Harvard PhD, don't fuck it up. I was told. And I appreciated my education a lot more, being around people who were equally smart, but simply, did not have two parents who were teachers who pushed you in school and assumed you were going to go to a good college and so on. So that was sort of, because of my parents, and then because of really a deep dive into blue collar working class America in Baltimore, as I was able to get a better job, quite frankly. Being a professor is a better job than being a cop, I think. And, professor jobs are becoming rarer and rarer, but so, I got one at John Jay College, and I've been there now for, over 20 years.
Yeah, with the, I mean, you're sort of in a position too where, going from academia into this, into the police force, that you're going to write about it. That, you're going to be able to, take all those experiences over, your 20 months in, on the beat and, write about it and to do stuff with it. And it's interesting just looking at cops. It's sort of like cops and professional wrestlers. Like, even if you're kind of like the, boring, no name guy, you're going to have insane stories to tell. Like I have a buddy of mine who works in wrestling, and he's like, yeah, you have guys who just, they just go and they do the work, and they have the most insane stories that you could possibly tell. And I think cops are the same way, but yet how many of them actually end up, telling those stories is another thing.
That's exactly it. And I tell them, like, you have to write it down at the time, because there are lots of cop memoir books, and some are better than others. But if you don't take the notes at the time, you can't, it changes the whole tone. Partly because, you forget things, but you also forget how you felt at the time. But in hindsight, because I banked my career on that, and Cop in the Hood, the book, it allows me now to talk to cops. In these interviews I did for Back from the Brink, I was actually amazed how eager everyone was to talk. And most were retired. That makes a big difference, because on the job, they're a bit paranoid about talking. But I did interview some cops who were on the job. Mostly, I knew them because I'd been their professor. But simply, when I'm introduced to people I don't know and they would say, okay. And the fact that I had been a cop really opened doors, because it allowed them to know that I understood where they were coming from at some level, that I wouldn't hear something and spin it in a sort of ignorant way, not knowing the work and the life experience they have. And just in terms of lingo and that, I don't think I could have done this book without having been a cop, because I don't think cops would have spoken to me, or trusted me, knowing that I wasn't, out to get them. But there's an interesting caveat to that, because, I have 2 books on policing now, is cops don't need to be portrayed as heroes. They just want an honest perspective. They feel strangely misunderstood and, victimized by a certain mainstream narrative. And as long as you're honest and you get it right, they're happy with that, warts and all. They really just, show it like it is. Show what we do. Show my perspective as it honestly is. And it is sort of a great desire to be heard in a non-ideological or non-biased way, just to be honest. And as you mentioned before, yeah, I mean, and they got great stories. Yeah. Back from the Brink it's a sort of a documentary of the era, but it's all from their perspective. It's in their voice. Because once I started interviewing these cops, I was like, why am I going to paraphrase what they said? I'm just going to sort of deaden the language and make it sound more formal. Like they speak so well on their own. Just put it in their voices and let them talk. The hard part then is, weaving a narrative out of that. And it took much longer, than I expected. I did the first interview 10 years ago. Wow. So it's been a 10-year project. Now, mind you, I didn't know what I was writing at first. I was just sort of doing the interviews and saying, okay, I want to look at the crime drop, whatever that means. But, over the course of a decade, I finally figured out what the story is and how to fill in the gaps, and got access to everybody and so on.
Did you film any of them, or
some? Excuse me. Some I did, because not at the start, but when COVID hit, I started doing them over Zoom, and interviewers are told that doing them in person is the way to go. But like this right now, I didn't find it any worse quality by doing it by Zoom or even on the phone. And partly because there was a specific story I realized I was trying to tell. But so I have those. And then I've done some other, because I have a Mortabund podcast myself that I might start up again when the book comes out in March, to show some of these voices, and so you can actually hear them. But so short answer is some are recorded on video, but most are not.
Yeah, and with the subject matter, and just knowing, just like having a book out myself, I can just know how tough it is to, get people to, buy your book, open it, crack it open, read it. Where it seems like everything is either, going like the podcast route, or there's a Netflix series out there. I forget the latest one from Netflix. I was talking to my wife about it last night. I don't know if it was Fear City. It might have been. Yeah, and I think it was either Fear Cities. Was Fear City?
I think it is Fear City, and I think I've seen it. I mean, I know the story of Fear City very well, and the pamphlet. There's a picture of that pamphlet in my book.
Yeah.
But that was before the 1975 layoffs. I think mostly the fire department was behind it, but the police as well. They produced a pamphlet warning what would happen, and it's what people forget. It became somewhat prophetic, but it was don't go out. Everything's dangerous and hell, and it is kind of amusing because it's very sensational, and it was probably never even distributed, or if it was, barely. But it got a lot of press, and it presented this nightmare scenario of New York City, and ironically, to some extent, it came to pass because the layoffs did happen, which no one really believed. Those layoffs are kind of where my book starts, because that was really the true, I think, nadir of New York City. To just it scarred the police department for a generation. They fired 5,000 cops, 3,000 sort of stayed off the job for a long time. It was 5 years or so before they hired another. And that's when the cadre of leaders who were in charge in the mid-90s came on the job before those layoffs. And one lesson is, if you got to reduce the police department, do it through attrition or something, but don't fire them. It was just brutal. And then the people who remained were sort of like, oh, this is what the city thinks of us. Screw that.
Who were so those that were fired, the 5,000, were they eventually like rehired, or were they fired without reason? Was it just kind of like their number
just
was
over? Like everyone thought it was a bluff, and people didn't understand the true crisis of the city's near bankruptcy. But just at midnight, message came over that it was through time on. So they just 5,000 people showed up at work and were told to turn in their badges and guns, and were told they no longer had a job. Just like that. And they thought it was going to be, it'll last for a week and then we'll get hired back. But no, most didn't.
Where did they go? Like what did those guys end up doing? I imagine there was a lot of drinking involved. If I know my cops,
they, most got another job and went on with their life, and that was the end of that. But I did, some were rehired, and so those are the ones I spoke to, the ones who did get their job back. But it also created this problem in that there were no new police officers on the force for a long time, and the numbers dropped to their lowest level. So things started to get better in the 80s with that, in the first half of the 80s, and then crack hit in the last half of the 80s, and things got worse again.
Yeah.
So it was the police department didn't sort of recover till David Dinkins and Peter Vallone Sr., the city council president from Astoria, got Safe Streets, Safe Cities passed, which hired thousands of police officers that conveniently came on the job right before and during Bratton and Giuliani. So they sort of got to reap the benefits of what Dinkins had started a few years earlier in this massive hiring of police officers.
I'm glad you said that, because just even as I was a kid at the time, during the the Dinkins administration, and I don't remember any good stuff about Dinkins. It seemed like, I forget if a family member described Dinkins as kind of like the fall guy in a way, and I don't know, but if there's merit to that, but yeah, I remember it was just sort of like never hearing anything good, but to hear that this kind of turnaround started under him, I think. Though he doesn't come off well in my book, because it's mostly from police officers' perspective, and boy, did they hate him. I mean, they always hate the mayor, but with one exception, cops loved Ed Koch. Oh yeah,
Ed Koch loved cops. So that's an interesting little footnote to history. But as somebody said, I don't know if Dinkins, really was ineffectual, but it certainly seemed that way, because he had a patrician attitude and was very hands off. But the things that he was elected to do, he failed at. And I'm thinking primarily of race relations in the city.
Mm.
And he, on a certain public safety perspective, which today is hard to imagine a left, politically left mayor, running on a public safety campaign. But though murders mostly declined when he was mayor, there were more murders when he left than when he started. So you can spin that either as crime is up or crime is down, as often happens. But it was really the Crown Heights riots and then followed by Washington Heights. But Crown Heights really sort of doomed him because he failed to keep basic public order in a very racial context even. And that kind of marked his the end of his political career. But he barely lost to Giuliani, but so it's not impossible. He could have won re-election and reaped some of the benefits. But he, the police department was not very effective when he was mayor. So that was a big change after he left, and Bratton was appointed commissioner in '94.
Yeah. Well, when people often talk about longing for the days of the old New York, I always wonder which old New York they're talking about, which decade. I produced a sketch comedy video some years back about a guy who is basically gentrifiers against gentrification. So a guy moves into New York, 3 weeks ago, and is already complaining about gentrification. He moved in, and talking about the old New York where it's like risk being murdered and on the street. Like that's what it was about. But it was a real fucking nightmare for the people who had to live through that.
I first visited New York in 1988. I was in high school. A friend of mine was a freshman at Columbia. And so I went to visit, and even then, arguably New York at its worst, I still got here and you take the city for what it is. And I was like, wow, this is the best city ever. All those things I saw in movies, they're real.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't quite realize they were all filmed in New York. And so you just walk down the street and it seemed like a movie set. That said, I mean, the fear was palpable. I mean, Chicago had much of the same trajectory, so it wasn't like I was, didn't know what cities were like and how to, have a certain sense of urban savvy and not live in fear. But that idea of, seeing real danger and avoiding it was very real at the time. And I use, murder numbers to sort of show it, but, the odds of getting killed are pretty slim. But murder, that violence correlates with a lot of other things. I mean, the car thefts and just general sort of disorder and threatening things on the street. Now we talk about issues of homelessness on the subways and it has gotten worse compared to 10 years ago, but it's still nothing compared to, what I saw in Grand Central Station of just giant, tent encampments around the station. And you just sort of, and the other, the lesson learned is at the time, people really thought like, well, we're never going to solve these problems, whether it's the big ones about violence or the small ones about squeegee men.
Mm-hmm.
Which also was solved under Dinkins, by the way, and people forget.
Giuliani gets credit for the squeegee.
Giuliani gets credit, and it was solved before he came into. And there's a little part in my book about that. The guy who actually solved it, it was Dinkins told Ray Kelly, to solve it, and they did, but it was too late. He already people don't remember, but that was actually like a major issue in the mayoral campaign. But it was solved too late, and he never really got credit for it. So, but it was strangely with some intelligent people, it was easy to solve. It wasn't intractable, just like graffiti on the subways was solved in the 1980s. But people tend to throw their hands up in the air and talk about root causes and, well, we have to end poverty and racism and, fix everything. No, we don't. It would be nice if we did. Those are real problems as well. But if we identify the problem correctly, whether it's graffiti on the subway or squeegee men sort of harassing drivers as they go across, wait in traffic to cross bridges, no, we can solve those pretty easily and not deal with those greater issues. And there's a great benefit in that.
How did they solve the squeegee issue?
They, Mike Julian and George Kelling was involved in it, though the same, Mr. Broken Windows himself. But Mike Julian was a chief at the time. He later became chief of personnel, one of the highest positions in the NYPD. But they did they recorded people. Julian said that wasn't necessary because he already knew what was going on. But they made it impossible for them to make money. And what they did is they warned them, and then they cited them, gave them tickets, and then any that remained they arrested. But they did it every 4 hours, and it was the constant. It wasn't just a single sweep, and then they would come back. So it took a month or two, but that's it. And once people realized, a lot of them had open warrants, so if they didn't listen to the warning, then they would get arrested once the warning popped when they were given a ticket. But he said very few arrests were actually made. They just said, you can't do it. And we're going to have part of it is people thought there were thousands of it because it seemed, they were in very visible locations, basically at the entrance to every bridge and tunnel. But the actual number was like 100. Mm-hmm. So like you're telling me a department of, tens of thousands of cops can't police a couple hundred people and just say, whatever your other problems are, and there were many, we're not letting you do this. But it was the constant enforcement and to sort of police it before they could make their money, because the threat of arrest did actually deter a lot of people, but it was they were in it as a hustle. So you took that away. Though I don't talk about them, they're the same thing with 3-card monte that used to be everywhere. I'm a little embarrassed to admit I did lose $20 to 3-card monte my first time in New York.
Rightfully
I don't know what I was thinking. And that was a lot of money back then.
$20 is $20, right? Yeah,
man. Not like $20 today. I really thought they were playing the long game and I could win once and leave, and boy, that didn't happen.
Well, it's so funny that you bring up both the the squeegee and the 3-card monte, because recently I was driving in Manhattan, and I looked over, and there was a guy set up playing. I don't know if it was 3-card monte. I didn't stop to partake, but he was playing cards, and he was surrounded by obvious tourists. And a couple of years ago, I remember driving with my wife in Manhattan, and we stopped, and here comes a fucking squeegee guy, and I was so blown. I was probably too angry for the situation, but it was sort of like my whole world was crumbling. Like here, it was like a throwback.
Yeah,
and I was like, they're back. The freaking squeegee guys are back.
It's funny, that still triggers the NYPD in a weird way. Like a precinct commander will get a call if there's a squeegee guy. That's still a legacy from that era. But yeah, I saw 3-card monte on Broadway in the 30s somewhere, and because because now they're tables and chairs, I could sort of cross the street and sit and watch them for a while. And I was and I watched them for like a half hour, and I know how the hustle runs, but I couldn't believe. I just kind of wanted to shout like, don't do it. Yeah. And you just saw, like, I saw a group leave, and then they came back presumably with more money, and it's like, oh my god, I wasn't going to get involved, but it is something that could be policed, and we've just changed. We've kind of given up on that, and it's a real. Yeah, to see that backslide, and it's not as bad as it was, but it's just unfortunate because it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, and I think you pointed out, like with the squeegee guys, maybe their numbers are like 100, and it is so. It's very interesting hearing about kind of the crimes that make the headlines in New York City, in particular the violent crimes, and I think a number of them recently, rightfully so. Like some of them were just so horrific, but then you see that it's a small amount of men predominantly who are committing these acts, and it's like, to your point, it's like you're saying that an army the size of the NYPD can't take care of 100 people, 50 people who are just causing mayhem in the city.
But it takes political will, and even in the 80s, and that in a way what was lacking under Dinkins is that political will to say this is something that we want to police.
Right.
And that doesn't mean arresting everyone. It really means policing as a verb. We're going to maintain public order. It goes back to Jane Jacobs and Death and Life of Great American Cities, this idea of, we can sort of have the neighborhood we want. But that will to police it, because at the time, there was a lot of opposition to policing it as well, because why are we harassing these poor squeegee men? They're not hurting anyone. They're just offering a service, and we need to provide housing and drug treatment, and under Bratton, and with the support of Giuliani, and I don't like to give Giuliani too much credit, but he did appoint Bratton. But that ended up being just a big clash of egos. But they said, no, you can't do this. We're going to say no to that. And same thing with graffiti. It's, it was just kids expressing themselves. And, by and large, graffiti artists were not violent criminals. It was an alternative to gang life in a lot of these neighborhoods. So it's not like they were necessarily bad people. But we just said, no, we're not going to let you tag up trains anymore. But yeah, a lot of people said no, that we shouldn't police it that way. So in that sense, it is just you don't have to convince the opponents. You just have to say we've heard you, and we don't buy that line of argument, and we're going to do things differently.
Yeah, I was watching a video recently. This guy Sean Fitzgerald, his handle is Actual Justice Warrior, and he does like deep dives into like these cases. And there was a case, I think it was from 2023, about this man had a problem with his neighbor's dogs barking. So one day he went with a hammer and was trying to break down the door, ended up hitting the woman with a hammer, assault, I think hurting a number of people. He was arrested, let out on bail, and then eventually he went back
where this goes,
and murdered the woman, her sister, and his real problem was with the dog, and the dog ended up, getting it too. And, you're talking, and, this is under the,
maybe the dog was the initial problem, but he wasn't, when he went back and killed them, he was no longer a neighbor. He was just a murderer then. That was vengeance.
Amen. Yeah. Amen. Amen. And it turns out that not only had this guy, attacked them with a fucking hammer, but he had stabbed the dog at a previous, even before that. So he had attacked the dog, before then. And this guy was let out, numerous times, eventually to go and to murder these poor people. When I think one of the things that really disgusts so many normal people who are reading about, these cases are just the rap sheets of the guys that are being let out. And it's not something like, he was just a graffiti artist or something like that. It's like, no, these guys are, violent criminals who have hurt people in the past, and then they're back on the streets, roaming for their next victim. So.
It's, last night I had a very pleasant drink with, I met the former head of the Bronx Defenders, who reached out to me and wanted to talk about stuff. We had a very nice time. But, we disagree on a lot of things. And I was trying to mention these things, like we're not actually talking about a large number of people. This is not the issue of mass incarceration. It's a few people. And look, if you can get them the help they need, however you want to find that, go right ahead. But in the meantime, no, I don't think they're going to get better in jail, but I don't want them on the street. Right. And it is, maybe everyone detained on that sort of grounds isn't going to be necessarily violent, but a good chunk are, and you're there because you have already done something. We have the political and legal and constitutional means, but then it's a question of prosecution and so on. And yeah, we're definitely moving away from that. Before it's going back to the 80s versus 90s, I do want to mention something, just because I can come off justifiably as pro-policing, but arrests in New York City went up more under Dinkins and community policing in the 80s than they did under Bratton and Giuliani and broken windows policing in the 90s. And people are generally unaware of that, because effective policing is not about producing numbers and making arrests. It's about preventing crime so you don't have to arrest anybody. And there was definitely more policing in the 90s, again, as a verb. But most of the crime drop from the mid-late 90s on happened at the same time that we were reducing the number of people in jail and then in prison in New York State. That was the great sort of victory. It wasn't that we simply locked everybody up, but we did perhaps lock up the right people.
Yeah. And my family, we have a butcher shop in Spanish Harlem, and my dad got it in the mid 80s. I think maybe it was like 4 when he got it. So if you track Spanish Harlem from before he would before his time all the way up through the 90s and into today, you see the incredible changes there. But there was also sort of like a relationship between kind of the street, police, and business owners. It was sort of a relationship of, I would say, respect and rationality to a point. Like my dad tells me a story of, there were quite a few police officers that he was very friendly with, and they looked out for him, and they would tell the local dealers, that's my friend, not on his block. And the dealers wouldn't go and sell on my dad's block, because and it wasn't like they were setting up a sting operation and using in front and all that. It was we know what you do, don't do it here.
That cops often, especially when they see that they can't change the greater world or the greater city or even the greater neighborhood, but you do sort of go for those little victories. Okay, as a cop in East Baltimore, and I mean, I would think, there's some bad drug corners, and I didn't take the war on drugs personally, but I would think, if I lived here, what would I want me to do? And the answer I came up with, as modest as it seems, is just shut these people up. Fine, sell your drugs. I can police it a bit and stop it for a moment, but I'm not going to win that battle in the long run. But why do you also have to be shouting, playing music, and breaking bottles and having a party? To some extent, you reach a peace with it. Okay, they're going to be selling drugs, but you don't have to be assholes while doing it. And that last part is something you can actually police a bit. And then ideally, then that group of young men hanging out can actually police themselves a bit. They'll say, "Oh, we're crossing a certain line here," just about public order, not actually the crimes they're committing. So sometimes that's the best you can do, and that's all right.
Yeah, it is wild. I mean, just the things you can get away with in life if you're just quiet about it. It's like, it's just, I'm sure there are a lot of, there's a reason why for the most part, perverts are very quiet on the subway. They want to,
as are,
what a silly thing to,
well, but also, also pickpockets and lush workers. And they're not in it to impress their friends at the moment. They're actually professional thieves. Low level professional. They're not like, doing jewel heists in the Diamond District thieves, but they just want your wallet. And so they're gonna lay low.
Yeah. And there's something too, like you described earlier, talking about the murder rate and the changes. And we can talk about, when it was at its high at peak in NYC and when it went down. And but it's sort of like, I see a lot of people having these arguments, especially when civilians are killed, or murdered in the city, where they'll often bring up, the murder rate and be like, well, your chances of blah, blah, of getting killed are so slim and blah, 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 as if the only measure of life in the city is whether or not I'm going to get murdered today. It's like, it's not like I'm going, it's not like I'm, going off to war. And I know when I step across that trench and run through no man's land, there's a good chance that artillery is going to, hit me and find me. It's like, no, I want to go about my day with, as
without
little
trauma.
Without trauma. Yeah, exactly.
I want to take the subway into work and be able to tune out. I don't want to have to pay attention to that guy twitching around. That's the quality of life stuff. It's also that, it's almost, I mock it as a cliche. It was worse in 1990, but it was worse in 1990. But what a bizarre benchmark. Oh, really? Until New York gets to its highest level of violence ever, everything's okay. Right. We had under 300 murders for 2 years in 2017 and 2018. Last year, I think at 377 or so. That's a pretty big increase. Sure, it's less than 2,000, and that's great. But we can do better. We know we can do better because we have done better quite recently. So people have a right to say, no, actually, things are going in the wrong direction. Though murders are also, down for the past few years, but it's still, a third higher than it was in 2017,
Yeah. Did talking about like throwbacks. I recently saw that the Guardian Angels are coming back. I don't know how strong their numbers are going to be, but did like Guardian Angels, local neighborhood watch groups. I know Bernie Goetz may have had done some numbers as far as bringing crime down, at least in some respects. What impact did that sort of have to sort of the population by itself, kind of keeping an eye out? Did that have an impact on crime?
My guess is probably not. I mean, look in the immediate vicinity of them, it might. I mean, look, Curtis Lee was a bit of an interesting character, to put it politely, but I do remember when I saw Guardian Angels on the Chicago L, riding late at night back in the 80s, and I felt safer. I knew at that moment no one was going to attack me. So there is that sense. But mostly I think what it did, whether it's the Guardian Angels or Curtis Lee, or Bernie Goetz, it did sort of highlight, like, we had a problem here. A problem that is to some extent being downplayed and ignored by people in power. And we're saying, enough of that already. The real turning point in New York was the murder of Brian Watkins. I don't know if you remember the name, but that was the white kid from Utah who was with his family to see the U.S. Open, and he got murdered at the 57th Street subway stop, or trying to protect his parents who were getting robbed and attacked. And that was what led to the famous headline, "Dave, do something." And Dave did. That's when Safe Street, Safe City sort of started. But often it takes we've had some, but there were 2,000 murders that year, and that's the one because it was a tourist. And I think, honestly, because it was a white kid, that's the one that got the big media attention and said, yeah, this is really out of control.
Yeah, I wonder how much of crime people will put up with just because it's sort of out of their, it's not
a huge amount.
It's not East New York, versus Astoria. It's like, yeah, that's East New York.
Well, and I mean, bringing to the modern day, you have these sort of progressive DSA politicians in city council, and they all they're in the largely white progressive neighborhoods that straddle the East River, from Astoria down through Long Island City and then into Brooklyn. And what bothers me is, crime is not a huge problem where I live, but they are imposing their police abolition beliefs on other neighborhoods that are suffering from it. It is very easy to say, well, and those other neighborhoods want more policing. I mean, and you see it. Look, the fact that the neighborhood of Corona, and I don't know how much inside baseball and your listeners know about New York City neighborhoods, but Corona is a neighborhood out in Queens, and it is heavily immigrant.
If you want some great Mexican food,
it's a great neighborhood, but it's a poor immigrant brown neighborhood, and the neighborhood of Corona voted for Trump, majority. That blew my mind, and it's because every single failed change in policy that has been imposed on them, and the ones that come to mind are street prostitution, illegal vending, and also a rise in violence. They have to suffer, and a lot of migrant shelters. They're living in that neighborhood, and they said to hell with this. But I mean, it just blows my mind that Corona voted for Trump. But that's what these policies are getting us. And each of those sort of things I mentioned happen in part because of a distinct change in policy that permitted it, whether it's taking vending enforcement away from the police, whether it's decriminalizing solicitation for the purpose of prostitution. These are all specific policies, and they achieve their goal, which is less policing. But it was imposed by people who don't live in those neighborhoods.
Yeah, and it's something too. I would imagine that a lot of the depolicing people are probably more pro-immigrant, or even maybe pro like open borders. And one of the selling points on immigrants, and I grew up with one. My dad, hardworking as can be. So it's like, here you have hardworking people who the messages are coming here to make a better life for themselves and their family. It's like, oh yeah, well, guess what? Those people who are coming here, they don't like criminals. They don't like, they've come here for a quality of life that they can't get back home. And to see sort of like, a regression, being kind of foisted upon them, through these policies, that they might do something like say, you know what, MAGA,
I do worry that people, I mean, look, I'm very pro-immigrant. It's why I love New York City. And, but but we're talking about criminals, not immigrants.
Right. Exactly.
It might be both. But once the idea of, I'm afraid that people actually believe that criminals represent a community. Either it's because they're public defenders and basically only deal with criminals and see them as typical, or they're just clueless and think, well, that's how they are. And, for my undergraduate students at John Jay College, who are all immigrants or kids of immigrants, they're not MAGA, though they may become MAGA if they get pushed that way. But they're the ones who live in neighborhoods are victimized by criminals. And so when they see, they're hardworking and their parents are hardworking, and they see people come here and then get arrested for crimes, victimizing them, victimizing their neighbors, and then get released. It's not sustainable. It's also just immoral. We have so many people in the city struggling and striving and often succeeding. We really do have to put them at the forefront of what our policy, of who our policies are designed to help.
Yeah. And with the Back from the Brink, you shared with me some of the galley, I believe it was, and also the some photos from it. And then there's some really great photos of transit police. There was two in particular, two black cops standing on at the subway, and I was sort of blown away by how skinny they were. It was like 1982. It's like, shit, people were skinny back then.
I included I'm very proud of the pictures in the book. I worked hard on those.
Oh, great. Yeah.
I don't know who. I mean, I have their name. I got their names from another transit cop. God, I hope I'm right. I was unable to reach them, and they're not in the book. But I just love that picture so much that I needed to include it. I found it in the New York Public Library, and the photographer I did reach out to, because it's his picture, and he graciously let me use it for free. But that is such a powerful. It just shows the era, and I mean, transit policing, those OG transit cops, man, they were tough. They were out there alone. They couldn't get backup. Respect. One of the guys in my book, Steve Hill, is still on the job after 30 some years. And
I saw the picture of it. That's a big dude.
He's a big dude. He's a great dude. I met him. He was my student, and I love that guy. And man, can he can tell a good story, but the stories he has of that era in East New York. So he, the other cop, that was actually Steve Hill's area. The other transit cop picture, and there's a fabulous story behind it, is by Martha Cooper, who I've known since I was a kid, because she, along with Harry Chalfant, did a subway art and those classic pictures of subway graffiti that have become iconic. And a friend of mine told me, "Oh, that's Bob Davin. I know him." And so I reached out to Bob Davin, who is also a great character and storyteller, now a friend of mine. And then I reached out to Martha Cooper, who happens to live on the Upper West Side conveniently, and she's a great person. And she said, "Oh, you can use that picture, but you have to indemnify me because I never got a release form. I don't know who they are." And I said, "Oh, I know who they are." And I actually had them meet at my house for the first time last year. The photographer and one of the guys, Ed Hannes, has died, but I got to bring them together to talk about that picture from like 1982 or something.
Is that the one with the cops in the leather jackets?
Yeah.
And I want to say, I want that leather jacket. I don't know how I can get it, but there was a time where you'd be lucky to find something like that in a thrift store for sure. One of my disappointments from being a cop in Baltimore was that we didn't have leather jackets, because I considered, like, if you're going to become a cop, at least you get a cool leather jacket out of it. I never did. Yeah. And with and I think the you talking about the transit cops of, yesteryear. It's hard for me to think about them without thinking about the image that I saw of, horrific image of the woman that was set ablaze on the train, and police officer just kind of walking, walking by. Not to mention, I mean, I think it was the same police officer who the friggin' suspect, the guy who did it.
I don't. Was it the? I don't know if it was the same cop. I'd like to know. Because
or one of the cops. Yeah, but
well,
right.
but I want to know, because I'm not willing to. It looks bad. He walks by. I'm not willing to cast blame based on what is literally 2 seconds in a video. Like it could be so brief that we don't know what he. But so if that was the same, I mean, what he should be doing is trying to get a fire extinguisher. Like I mean, there's. And you should be staying calm, but it does look bad, and it might be bad. But if that is then the same cop who goes up to the murderer, I know how to secure a crime scene, and tells him to leave, right. Like this is caught on body cam. That is bad policing. And so if that's the same cop, I'll throw him under the bus for both of those things. But I can't believe they had to murder. You don't let someone leave the scene of a crime, especially, there is, I don't know if it's true, but I think it is, especially when it comes to arson. People like to watch the fruits of their labor. And in this case, that's exactly what was happening. But you don't go to a murder scene and tell everyone to get away. You hold them there.
Yeah. Yeah. There are times when when I think like, oh, maybe I've become numb, after just seeing all this stuff, and then I see something like that, and I'm just like, wow, I thought things could go, sink to the bottom, but there's so much further things can go, I guess.
But it also shows that murder is exact. You can never show when a murder is prevented when it doesn't happen, because it just doesn't happen. But that situation is exactly where quality of life policing. Call it broken. I mean, I'm saying broken windows policing, but that term is so misunderstood and somewhat toxic in certain circles. I'm not attached to the term, but the concept of policing quality of life. That murder could have been prevented at so many different levels, at so many different chances, had a basic level of policing happened. First of all, of course, the murderer jumped the turnstile. They always do. It's almost pathological. Would that have stopped it if he paid his fare? Probably not, but you never know. But that homeless woman on the train should not have been on the train. She should have been removed from the train because she was violating rules of riding the subway. And had we done that, she wouldn't have been murdered. She'd still be alive. She could have chosen to go to a shelter. Or she could have gone to the street. Again, this is not a long-term solution to homelessness, but not on the subway. There's a very kind of profound but also simple theory, routine activity theory, which states the obvious, but the guy who invented it, Professor Felsen, said, if it's so obvious, why don't you think of it? But to have a crime, you need a convergence of target, offender, and time. You need those three things together, and it's useful because if you can just remove one of those, you prevent the crime. And none of those things should have come together in this situation. And that is why we've had, I think there were 11 murders on the subway last year. Again, not long ago, there was 0. And they've inched up every year from 0 to 11. And again, and the number still isn't that big, but it correlates, it indicates a general decline in public safety and disorder on the subways. But this idea of having the subway system as a proxy shelter is it's not right for riders and it's not right for people living there. It's not a safe place.
Yeah. I guess a local question. Are you being fucked by the congestion pricing? Or are you?
I love it. I'm a lefty in most things. I was going to the West Side Y yesterday, and I was on the subway. And first of all, I noticed traffic was flowing in Queens Plaza, and I was like, "This is 5:30 p.m." I'm like,
"Oh, really? Oh, okay."
And then I, looked on Google Maps, and rush hour weekday in New York City, it would have been faster for me to drive or take a cab than to take the subway or ride a bike. And that never has happened going crosstown and over the bridge at rush hour. I'm like, wow, I might start thinking about actually taking cabs if it's faster. So, I mean, I also work in Hell's Kitchen, or the northern tip of it. But I mean, look, I don't have a car. It's part of the reason I love New York City is I don't want a car. So I I have a strong dislike of other people driving. It makes my life worse. So the idea that I can get around faster and not hear horns and not have so much traffic in Manhattan, I love it.
Well, I guess I'm lucky in that I don't have to do a daily commute to New York City. But I think what would make you really happy is bring those squeegee guys back, because then you're just walking by going.
I just went, well, it's funny. Yeah. I mean, they had they done congestion pricing, they could have eliminated squeegee men back then, simply because cars wouldn't be stopped as much. There's still traffic lights. But to see traffic flowing in Midtown Manhattan is really amazing. Seems like a win for everybody but the New York Post.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna. So my first, it'll be my first drive back into the city. Will be this Thursday. At least when we might release this a little after my first drive, so I can report on that. So I'm going to be going to like Midtown and then to Brooklyn for two stand-up spots. So I'll report back and see how it is. I bet I might be put in this situation where I'm like, oh, I like it. I know I'm driving, but I kind of like the,
Well, I mean, it comes down to, are you willing to, well, you don't have a choice, but are you willing to pay $9 so you're not stuck in traffic for a half hour trying to get there? Yeah. And I think most people would, especially, the opponents who I don't know, that there's some ideological pro-car position that doesn't, I don't know, it's bizarre to me, the opposition to it. But, businesses are going to embrace this because of the delivery people that were saying, oh my God, they won't be able to afford it. The time saved is going to be such a win for delivery people and businesses. And I'm thinking, last night I was thinking of, taxi drivers in Midtown again, because the reason I don't take cabs is part because of the money and part because of the subway, but also because they wouldn't get you where you're going. It took forever. Yeah. It could be a game changer. We'll see. Maybe people will realize, you get the idea of induced demand and the roads will become congested when people realize $9 in New York City actually isn't that much. But it really is amazing to see right now. Something I've never seen, which is rush hour traffic flowing.
At least for a while. My parents are still in Queens, out in near kind of like the edge of Queens, Long Island, and man, getting there, it's been a nightmare sometimes. It's just been insane. But Peter Moskos, thank you so much for joining me. Your book, Back from the Brink, is coming out in March of this year. I hope everybody who's listening, you guys, can they pre-order it? Is it available?
Yeah, it's on Amazon right now. So please do. So they say that's really good pre-orders. I don't quite know why, but yes, please pre-order.
I think it has to do with the algorithm. So it's like pre-orders and reviews. So I guess it would be tough for the reviews to come in from readers because they don't have it yet, but that'll be good. And hopefully, come March, I'll be riding the subway or driving my car and I'll see people, with the book in hand. So that'd be great.
Excellent.
Thanks
for having me on.
You got it.